A cereal box shouting "Heart Healthy" can hide more sugar than a donut, while a plain pot of beans quietly outperforms designer snacks. The labels promise salvation. Your arteries get noise. We've been sold buzzwords, not clarity, and the cost shows up on EKGs. What if the fastest way to protect your heart is to ignore most of the packaging? The real rules are simple, specific, and almost never printed in big type. Here's how to decode them before your next bite. The supermarket aisle is quiet until you start reading. Heart smart, light, plant-powered, whole grain goodness. A middle-aged man in a navy blazer pauses, phone in one hand, lip caught in his teeth as he scrolls through his lab portal. His LDL is up, his doctor wants changes, and every box at eye level insists it's the solution. That's the daily dilemma for millions of Americans. Real risk on one side, loud promises on the other, made more urgent by a disease that remains the country's leading killer. Cardiovascular disease accounts for roughly 1 in 5 deaths in the United States, and the World Health Organization estimates close to 18 million deaths globally each year. Hospital wards are younger than they used to be. Hypertension, prediabetes, and high cholesterol are showing up in 30 and 40-somethings who grew up on drive-through dinners and vending machine breakfasts. Global burden of disease analyses have long tied a sizable share of cardiovascular mortality to diet patterns high in sodium and refined grains and low in fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and fiber. The stakes are not abstract. Clogged arteries, strokes, heart failure, and lives shortened by preventable risk. Yet we navigate this crisis through a fog of marketing. The Food and Drug Administration has debated what healthy should mean on a label, while the American Heart Association's Heart Check program approves products that meet specific limits for sodium, saturated fat, and added sugars. Those are meaningful steps, but heart healthy is not a single, legally fixed term, and front-of-pack claims can still emphasize one virtue while hiding several vices. A cereal fortified with vitamins can carry a wholesome halo while delivering more added sugar than a dessert. A plant-based entree can be built from starches and seed oils, low in fiber and high in sodium. A whole grain cracker can list enriched flour first, making the phrase technically true but nutritionally soft. If you strip away the hype, the science is remarkably consistent. Dietary patterns that lower LDL cholesterol, tame blood pressure, and reduce inflammation, think DASH, Mediterranean, or the Portfolio diet, tend to emphasize minimally processed plants, intact grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. They limit saturated fats and refined carbohydrates, and they deliver substantial fiber, especially the viscous kind that helps pull LDL out of circulation. Trans fats, once ubiquitous in packaged goods, are largely out. Saturated fat from processed meats and full-fat dairy is down. Unsaturated fats from olive oil, nuts, seeds, and fish occupy a modest, helpful middle ground. Calories matter for weight control, but the matrix of a food, its structure, fiber content, and nutrient density often matters more for how your body handles those calories over time. So why all the confusion? Because the Western diet is engineered to be easy, cheap, shelf-stable, intensely palatable, and ease rarely aligns with clarity. Most of us eat a third of our calories outside the home, where portion sizes are large and sodium is hidden everywhere. At the grocery store, ultra-processed foods dominate. They're fast, they travel well, and they speak in friendly slogans. Add a news cycle that whiplashes from fat is bad to fat is back, or from carbs are the enemy to carbs power athletes, and you get perfectly reasonable people picking up products that sound virtuous and deliver very little cardiovascular benefit. This story is about getting past the slogans to the mechanics of how diet moves your numbers. Heart healthy, in practical terms, means a way of eating that steadily lowers LDL cholesterol, improves blood pressure, keeps insulin and blood sugar on a more even keel, and helps you maintain or reach a healthy weight without white-knuckle hunger. It's not a brand or a single aisle. It's a pattern that you can assemble from affordable staples as easily as from specialty items. The good news is that once you understand a few core concepts, what counts as a whole food, what plant-based really promises, why fat quality beats fat quantity, and how fiber does its quiet work, the labels get much easier to ignore. We'll start with the foundation because every other claim sits on top of it. What precisely is a whole food, and how do you spot one in the wild of the modern supermarket? Start at the produce section and slow down. The oranges are still oranges, the carrots still look like carrots, and the lettuce wilts if you ignore it, signs that structure hasn't been engineered away. Across the aisle, a wall of boxes offers blueberry flavor without a blueberry in sight. In an age of powderized, extruded, and emulsified, whole doesn't mean rustic or trendy. It means the food looks and behaves like the thing it started as, with its natural fibers, cell walls, and nutrients largely intact. Public health researchers have a vocabulary for this. In the NOVA classification used by nutrition epidemiologists, whole or minimally processed foods are those that have been washed, cut, frozen, dried, ground, or pressed, but not reformulated with additives meant to mimic flavors or textures. Oats, rolled or steel-cut, fit. A sweetened, high-protein oat cluster shaped into cartoon stars does not. Beans are quintessential whole foods whether you buy them dry or canned. The difference is time and, in canned versions, sodium, which you can reduce significantly by rinsing underwater. Vegetables and fruits hold their status even when frozen, a convenience that locks in nutrients and saves money. Nuts and seeds belong here too, especially when they come without a gloss of sugar or palm oil. Then there are the edge cases that trip people up. Olive oil, obviously pressed from a fruit, is still a processed product, but it's a minimal mechanical process that preserves the polyphenols and monounsaturated fats consistently linked with better lipid profiles in Mediterranean-style eating. Plain yogurt is milk, plus live cultures. The fermentation changes the food but doesn't burden it with stabilizers and syrups. Fish is a whole food when it's a fillet or a can of salmon or tuna packed in water or olive oil. Once it's breaded, injected with flavorings and par-fried, the label tells the story. Long ingredient lists, higher sodium, and added fats push it away from whole. Why does the structure matter? Because the matrix of a food, its intact fibers, the way nutrients are packaged within cells, governs how quickly we digest it and how sharply our blood sugar and insulin respond. Intact oats digest slower than pulverized oat flour, leading to steadier energy and, over time, better cardiometabolic numbers. Beans bring soluble fiber and plant sterols that help lower LDL cholesterol by binding bile acids in the gut. Whole fruits deliver vitamins alongside fiber and water. Juice strips away the scaffolding that slows absorption, turning a serving into a swift sugar delivery. When you keep the structure, you keep satiety. And that makes portion control less of a willpower contest and more of a design feature. The marketplace blurs these lines with half-truths. A bread can advertise made with whole grains, while listing enriched flour first. A cracker stamped with multigrain can be a mosaic of refined flours. Peanut butter can be ground peanuts and salt, or it can be a confection padded with sugar and hydrogenated oils. Even yogurt, which sounds inherently wholesome, can rival dessert when the fruit is a syrup and the crunch is candy. The simplest field test is almost embarrassingly low-tech. Pick up the package, find the ingredient list, and see if it reads like a recipe your grandmother could cook. Cost and convenience, often blamed for derailments, can be allies here. Store-brand frozen spinach, berries, and broccoli are budget-friendly whole foods that last weeks. Canned tomatoes and beans make weeknight dinners feasible. Choosing low-sodium versions or rinsing pays dividends. A bag of rolled oats costs pennies per bowl compared with flavored packets whose sugar crowds out fiber. Buying fish doesn't require a fishmonger. Shelf-stable sardines or salmon bring omega-3 fats without the markup. None of this is glamorous, but the glamour has never been what improves a lipid panel. Evidence supports these choices beyond common sense. Cohort studies consistently associate higher intakes of minimally processed plant foods, whole grains, legumes, fruits, nuts, with lower cardiovascular risk, independent of weight. Trials of dietary patterns anchored in these foods have shown reductions in LDL cholesterol and blood pressure significant enough to matter clinically. That's not because they wear the right claims on the front. It's because their structure and composition do predictable work inside the body. If whole foods sound like a shopping rule, they're really the raw materials of a pattern. The question becomes, what balance of these staples and what room for animal foods adds up to a sustainable way of eating for your heart? The next step is defining what plant-based truly means and what it doesn't. On a Tuesday morning in a cardiology clinic in Cleveland, a dietitian sketches a plate on a whiteboard, leafy greens piled high, a scoop of lentils, a wedge of roasted squash, a sprinkle of walnuts. This is plant-based, she tells a 52-year-old sales manager who had assumed it meant giving up everything he liked. It's a pattern, not a purity test. The center of gravity is plants, vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, seeds, with room, if desired, for modest amounts of animal foods that don't crowd out the staples. That distinction matters because plant-based has been commandeered by the freezer aisle and the drive-thru, where it can mean a pea protein patty engineered with the same salt and saturated fat profile as a burger. In nutrition research, the term points to overall patterns, not single products. The plant-forward diets most consistently linked with heart benefits, DASH, Mediterranean, and vegetarian variations, share a simple architecture. Fiber-rich plants at every meal, intact grains instead of refined ones, beans and lentils as routine proteins, nuts and seeds for texture and healthy fats. Animal foods, if included, are supporting players. Fish, in place of processed meats. A cup of plain yogurt, a dusting of cheese rather than a duvet. The cardiovascular logic is straightforward. Plants deliver viscous soluble fiber that helps lower LDL cholesterol by interrupting bile acid reabsorption in the gut. They pack potassium and magnesium that nudge blood pressure down, and a spectrum of polyphenols that, in trials, have shown anti-inflammatory and endothelial benefits. Swap red and processed meats for legumes, and you reduce saturated fat and heme iron while increasing fiber and plant sterols, a combination associated with better lipid profiles. In large cohorts, higher adherence to healthful plant-based patterns correlates with lower rates of coronary heart disease, independent of weight, smoking, and physical activity. None of this requires an identity shift to vegan if that's not practical or appealing. Pescatarians who build meals around vegetables, beans, whole grains, and nuts, and then add fish a couple of times a week often see improvements in triglycerides and LDL. Flexitarians who center plants and treat animal foods as condiments rather than anchors move their numbers in the right direction too. What changes is what's routine. A bean stew on a weeknight, oatmeal with berries in the morning, a big salad with chickpeas and seeds for lunch, roasted vegetables with farro for dinner. The optional items, an egg, some yogurt, a piece of fish, fit into the margins rather than claiming the middle. The pitfalls are predictable and fixable. Plant-based on a wrapper doesn't guarantee fiber, and many ultra-processed plant foods are long on starches and refined oils while being short on the very nutrients that help your heart. Coconut oil is plant-derived but high in saturated fat. Fruit juice is technically plant-based, but strips out the fiber that tempers sugar absorption. Even a vegan cookie is still a cookie. The closer your plants are to their original form, beans rather than isolates, oats rather than oat flour, fruit rather than fruit snacks, the more likely they are to do the work you want done on your blood pressure and cholesterol. Questions about protein come up in nearly every consult. The numbers are reassuring. Beans, lentils, tofu, tempeh, nuts, seeds, and whole grains stack up to adequate intakes for most adults, and distributing protein across meals aids satiety and muscle maintenance. For fully vegan eaters, vitamin B12 needs attention. For those relying heavily on plant iron, pairing legumes and leafy greens with vitamin C-rich produce improves absorption. But these are practical tweaks, not structural obstacles. The larger point remains. When plants dominate the plate, fiber climbs, sodium often falls, calorie density tends to drop, and the cardiovascular risk factors we track begin to soften. In homes where food is a social glue, pattern change can be gradual and communal. A family in El Paso told me they started with meatless Mondays and discovered they liked black bean tacos enough to make them a Wednesday staple. A retiree in Atlanta learned to batch cook lentil soup and roast pans of vegetables so lunches were automatic. These are small, repeatable shifts with outsized effects because they replace defaults, not just add chores. Plant-based eating, in other words, is less a label than a lens. Choose foods that grew from the ground, keep them close to their original form, and let animal foods, if you want them, play a smaller, more careful role. That lens brings us to a crucial clarification often lost in the slogans. This isn't about stripping all fat, but about choosing the right kinds. Next, we'll untangle what low fat should mean for your heart and why the fats from olive oil, nuts, seeds, and fish don't belong in the same category as the ones you want to cut. The misunderstanding begins with a memory. A wave of fat-free everything in the 1990s when shoppers were told that any fat was the enemy. In a church basement nutrition class I sat in on last month, a woman raised her hand and said she'd thrown out her olive oil because her cardiologist told her to eat low fat. The dietitian shook her head. Low in the wrong fats, she said, drawing 2 columns. One was butter, bacon, cheese, pastries, coconut oil. The other was extra virgin olive oil, walnuts, almonds, pumpkin seeds, salmon. The line between them is the difference between chasing a slogan and changing a risk profile. At heart, low fat should be shorthand for limiting saturated and eliminating trans fats, not a command to banish all fats. Saturated fats, concentrated in processed meats, full-fat dairy, many baked goods, and tropical oils, raise LDL cholesterol by downregulating the liver's LDL receptors. leaving more circulating particles to deposit in artery walls. Trans fats, created when oils are industrially hydrogenated, worsen the picture by both raising LDL and lowering protective HDL while promoting inflammation. They're effectively banned in U.S. packaged foods, but can linger in imported items and in some restaurant fryers abroad. On the other side are unsaturated fats, monounsaturated in olive oil and many nuts, polyunsaturated in certain seeds and fish, that tend to lower LDL when they replace saturated fats and can improve the function of blood vessels. The evidence is not a fad cycle. It's decades of converging data. Controlled feeding trials show that swapping saturated fat for polyunsaturated fat drops LDL cholesterol in predictable, clinically relevant steps. Large observational studies link diets richer in unsaturated fats and poorer in saturated and trans fats with fewer coronary events. A landmark trial in Spain found that a Mediterranean-style pattern supplemented with extra virgin olive oil or nuts reduced major cardiovascular events compared with a controlled diet, underscoring that fat quality in the context of a plant-forward pattern matters. The American Heart Association translates that into practical guidance. Keep saturated fat low, especially if you have high LDL, while making room for modest amounts of unsaturated fats from olive oil, nuts, seeds, and fish. What this doesn't mean is trading a pat of butter for a flood of oil. All fats are calorie-dense, and portion size still counts. But cooking vegetables in olive oil instead of butter shifts the fatty acid profile in your favor. Snacking on a small handful of almonds nudges HDL up and can help tame post-meal blood sugar. Replacing sausage with salmon once or twice a week brings marine omega-3s that lower triglycerides and may reduce arrhythmic risk. These are swaps that change the inputs your arteries see without requiring a joyless plate. The marketplace again complicates things. Low-fat yogurt can be a sugar delivery vehicle. Fat-free cookies are still refined starch and sweetener. When manufacturers pull out fat, they often add sugars and thickeners that raise triglycerides and don't improve satiety. The result can be worse blood work despite virtuous-sounding labels. A smarter label read looks for lower saturated fat and the presence of unsaturated fats, rather than zero fat. Butter blends touting made with olive oil still carry significant saturated fat. Coconut oil, though plant-derived, is predominantly saturated and nudges LDL upward. Meanwhile, extra virgin olive oil brings polyphenols that may aid endothelial function. And nuts and seeds pack minerals and fiber alongside their fats. Restaurants add another wrinkle. Deep fryers using repeatedly heated oils produce breakdown products that no label discloses. The safer approach is to favor grilled, baked, or steamed dishes and ask for dressings and sauces on the side. At home, the compromises are gentler. Sauté with olive oil instead of butter, choose leaner cuts and smaller portions of meat, and let plant proteins do more of the heavy lifting. If numbers help, people with high LDL often aim for saturated fat in the single-digit percentage of total calories, a target that, for many, translates to swapping daily cheese for a drizzle of oil and a handful of nuts spread across the week. But even the best fat choices are only half the cardiometabolic equation. To pull LDL down further, steady post-meal glucose, and feel full on fewer calories, you need the structural ally that modern labels rarely celebrate. That ally is fiber, especially the viscous soluble kind from oats, beans, and fruit, and it comes with clear, measurable targets. 2 months after that first whiteboard lesson, the sales manager from Cleveland walks back into clinic with a small victory on his lab printout. His LDL has dipped, not dramatically, but enough to get his cardiologist's attention. The biggest change, he says, has been breakfast and lunch. Oatmeal instead of flakes, bean chili instead of deli meats, an apple at 3 o'clock when he used to cruise the vending machine. The dietitian circles a single line on his food diary, fiber, 30 day, and nods. Hitting that number wasn't an accident, it was the point. High fiber is more than a buzzword. For most adults, it means getting roughly 25 to 38 grams a day, on the low end for women, the high end for men, with a meaningful share coming from viscous soluble fiber. That's the type in oats and barley, beta-glucans, beans and lentils, pectins and gums, and many fruits like apples and citrus. In the gut, these fibers absorb water and form a gel that slows digestion and carries cholesterol-rich bile acids out of the body. The liver draws more LDL from circulation to make new bile, and over weeks the numbers move. Controlled trials show that adding 5 to 10 grams a day of viscous soluble fiber can lower LDL cholesterol by about 5 to 10%. Enough to matter, especially layered on top of better fat choices. The benefits don't stop at LDL. By slowing the rate at which food leaves the stomach and is absorbed in the small intestine, viscous fibers blunt post-meal glucose spikes and the insulin surges that follow. That steadier curve is good for blood vessels and makes the late afternoon energy crash less likely. Downstream in the colon, microbes ferment fiber into short-chain fatty acids that seem to have anti-inflammatory effects and may modestly lower blood pressure. Put more simply, fiber changes the tempo of a meal inside your body, stretching out satiety signals so you feel full on fewer calories while quietly improving markers your doctor tracks. The practical question is how to reach the target most days without a spreadsheet. The answer lives in ordinary portions. A bowl of cooked oatmeal is roughly 4 grams of fiber before you add berries. A half cup of beans brings 7 to 8. An apple adds 4. A handful of nuts contributes a couple more. Vegetables pull weight too, particularly if they're present at lunch and dinner in generous portions. Many people come into clinic averaging 15 grams a day, the national norm. The jump to 30 happens less by hunting fiber-fortified labels and more by swapping in foods that carry their own structure, intact grains instead of refined ones, legumes in place of processed meats, fruit instead of juice. Supplements can play a supporting role. Psyllium husk, the main ingredient in some over-the-counter fibers, is a viscous soluble fiber with clinical evidence behind it. For people with high LDL, a dose with breakfast and dinner can be a pragmatic bridge while food habits change. But even here, the context matters. A spoonful of psyllium mixed into a sugary yogurt or washed down with a sweetened coffee undercuts the point. And for anyone ramping up fiber quickly, the advice is homely and effective. Add a bit at a time, drink water, and give your gut a week to adapt. Not all fiber on ingredient lists acts the same. Chicory root fiber and other isolates can swell the total grams without delivering the viscosity that drives LDL lowering, and for some they cause bloating. That doesn't make them villains so much as a reminder that numbers can mislead. The more your fiber arrives wrapped inside beans, oats, fruit, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, the more likely it is to do the cardiac work you want. By the end of our appointment, the sales manager has a plan that feels less like a diet than a set of defaults. Oats most mornings, beans most days, fruit within reach. His goal isn't perfection, it's momentum. And momentum is what binds these ideas together. When you pair high fiber with a plant-forward plate and better fat choices, the effects add up. LDL drops further, blood pressure eases, inflammation cools, and weight management gets simpler. That synergy is the heart of Heart Healthy, and it's where we turn next. On rounds at a Midwestern heart clinic, a cardiologist makes a habit of translating lab panels into levers. "We can pull 4 at once," she tells a new patient, tapping the screen. LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, inflammation, and weight. A whole food, plant-forward pattern, low in saturated fat, high in fiber, doesn't chase one number. It nudges all 4 in the right direction and keeps them there. The art is in the combination, not the hero ingredient. LDL moves first because it's the most responsive to diet. Cutting saturated fats from processed meats, full-fat dairy, and baked goods and replacing them with unsaturated fats from olive oil, nuts, seeds, and fish increases the liver's uptake of LDL particles. Layer in viscous soluble fiber from oats, beans, and certain fruits, and you pull more cholesterol-rich bile out of circulation. The effect is additive. Controlled trials show that swapping saturated for polyunsaturated fat lowers LDL, and that adding 5 to 10 grams of viscous fiber daily trims another 5 to 10%. Diets that combine these elements, like the portfolio diet built around plant sterols, viscous fiber, nuts, and soy, have produced LDL reductions in the 20% range, a clinically meaningful shift for people trying to avoid more medication. Blood pressure responds to what rides along with those foods. Vegetables, legumes, and whole grains deliver potassium, magnesium, and nitrates that support vascular function, while cooking at home trims hidden sodium. In the original DASH trials, participants eating a plant-rich, low-saturated fat pattern saw systolic pressure drop by about 5 to 11 points within weeks, even without dramatic weight loss. Add modest weight reduction, often a byproduct of higher fiber, lower calorie density meals, and the numbers fall further, easing the mechanical load on the heart and the wear on arteries. Inflammation and endothelial health, the quieter drivers of plaque vulnerability, also bend. Polyphenols in extra virgin olive oil, berries, and leafy greens have been linked to improved endothelial function. Omega-3s from fish lower triglycerides and may reduce arrhythmic risk. When people shift from refined to intact plant foods, the gut microbiome produces more short-chain fatty acids, compounds associated with lower inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. In Mediterranean-style trials, these patterns translated into fewer major cardiac events, a reminder that the biology under the microscope eventually shows up in the ER log. Weight, finally, is less a separate project than a downstream consequence of food structure. Whole foods with intact fiber and water have lower calorie density and require more chewing. They slow eating speed and stretch satiety signals. A bowl of bean stew and a salad drizzled with olive oil leave most people fuller on fewer calories than a plate of refined pasta with creamy sauce. Steadier blood sugar and insulin from viscous fiber reduce the late evening raids on the pantry. Over months, that difference accumulates as smaller portions feel sufficient without a tally sheet. Take these shifts together, and the picture is not dramatic so much as durable. LDL inches down, blood pressure eases, inflammatory sparks cool, the scale moves a few pounds in the right direction. Each lever amplifies the others. Lower LDL means fewer particles to oxidize. Lower inflammation means less damage when they do. Lower blood pressure means less stress on vessel walls, and lower weight makes every step easier to maintain. It's a systems approach in a kitchen, and it shows up in the data as well as in clinic notes. The catch is that this pattern is swimming against a current. For most people, the default is not a produce aisle and a pot of beans. It's a landscape of drive-thrus and packages calibrated for bliss points. To understand why these gains can be so hard to secure and so easy to undo, you have to look squarely at the modern Western diet and what it's built to deliver. Walk into any highway rest stop at noon, and the menu reads like a blueprint. White buns, battered protein, fries, fountain drinks, a cookie display the size of a bookcase. The calorie count is now posted in polite fonts, but the real design lives in the ratios: refined grains, added sugars, sodium, and saturated fat stacked together, fiber, and afterthought. This is the default diet of a busy country. It's not just what we choose, it's what's most available, cheapest per calorie, and hardest to resist. Nutrition researchers have a name for much of this: ultra-processed foods, a category defined not by kitchens but by factories. In the NOVA system used in public health, these are products built from refined starches, extracted oils, sugar, and additives engineered for shelf life and a bliss point of salt-sugar fat. In the United States, they now supply well over half of adult calories and nearly 2/3 for children. They also account for the vast majority of added sugars in the diet. The average American consumes around 3,400 milligrams of sodium a day, far above the recommended limit, and only about 15 to 16 grams of fiber, far below target. Those numbers aren't trivia. They sketch the metabolic terrain clinicians see in exam rooms. Mechanistically, the Western pattern moves risk through multiple channels at once. Refined grains and sugary drinks digest quickly, spiking blood glucose and insulin, which encourages fat storage and, over time, a shift towards smaller, denser LDL particles that penetrate artery walls more easily. Saturated fats from processed meats, pizza, cheese, and pastries raise LDL directly. Sodium inflates blood pressure by pulling water into the bloodstream, stressing vessels and the heart. Low fiber removes a major brake on all of the above. Less viscosity in the gut to slow absorption, fewer short-chain fatty acids made by gut microbes to calm inflammation, weaker satiety signals to keep portions in check. Portion size amplifies the effect. Compared with the 1970s, today's commercial muffins, sodas, and fast food entrees are routinely 2 or 3 times larger. That isn't just a supersized joke. It changes how much energy arrives before fullness kicks in. In a controlled NIH crossover study, volunteers given ultra-processed meals ate about 500 calories more per day than when they were offered minimally processed foods matched for macronutrients and palatability, and they gained weight within 2 weeks. Speed matters. Softer textures and liquid calories are easy to consume quickly, outrunning the body's satiety timing. Marketing and logistics do the rest. Price promotions push combo meals, sugary coffee drinks smuggle dessert into breakfast, whole grain stamped on a high-sugar cereal, or plant-based on a deep-fried patty launder a health halo over familiar formulas. In neighborhoods with fewer supermarkets and more convenience stores, the path of least resistance is even narrower. A mother working a double shift can feed 3 kids faster with a value pizza than with a pot of beans, and the system counts on it. The clinical pattern that follows is not mysterious. LDL creeps up, triglycerides rise, HDL wanes, blood pressure inches into the 130s and 140s. Waistlines expand as calorie density and eating rates stay high. Inflammatory markers tick upward. Over years, this metabolic profile makes arteries more vulnerable to plaque buildup and rupture. Large cohort studies from multiple countries consistently tie higher intake of ultra-processed foods to greater risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, even after adjusting for age, income, and activity. The signal is clearest for sugary beverages and processed meats, but the pattern is broader. A diet light on structure and heavy on engineered convenience loads the dice. None of this assigns moral failure to people navigating that landscape. It describes incentives. The industry optimizes for taste, shelf life, and margin. Our biology is tuned to crave concentrated energy and salt. Time and money are finite. Against that alignment, advice to eat better sounds abstract, but it isn't abstract to the cardiologist trying to move 4 levers in a patient's favor. The fix is not boutique. It's a return to foods with structure, fats chosen for quality, and fiber brought back to its rightful center. The pieces are already on the board. We've defined the pattern that helps and the pattern that harms. The practical question now is what to do in the aisle and at the stove on a Wednesday night. How to translate this into a cart and a week that bend the numbers without bending your life.